All right, everybody, welcome to the podcast. I'm Clayton Hester. Today we have with us Dr. Gary Wolfe, and we're going to be talking about the subject of religion and science fiction. And while it is a niche subject, as we were kind of discussing ahead of time, it's also a very broad subject in that there's just so much that goes into it. It's interesting to see the ways in which science fiction, primarily focusing on things like, well, science, first of all, and how that naturally, in some way, as part of the human experience as well, and how the science turns in on the human experience, seems to be a pretty consistent recurrence. Would you say something to that effect, or what is your thoughts on that?
Well, I think one of the things that's obvious about the relationship of science and religion is that they ask a lot of the same questions. They ask about the origin of the universe, the possible end of the universe, the ethical responsibilities. There are all kinds of issues that clearly are kind of eschatological issues. The difference is, of course, that science, and by extension, I think science fiction, tends to look at what they consider to be measurable, replicable results rather than faith. So I've talked to a number of science fiction writers who believe that there's a natural disconnect between science fiction and religion, because science fiction is not based on faith, it's based on evidence. And therefore, a lot of the stories, a lot of the classic stories that deal with religion in science fiction, and there are a lot, deal with that conflict. You know, they deal with a challenge to faith. Or, as you remember, one of the lectures I talked about in the series started off with what I consider the worst science fiction story in the world, which has been done over and over again. It even made it to the Twilight Zone, where you've got a couple of characters at the end of the world, and they're the last two humans on Earth after a nuclear war or something. And at the very end, we find out that their names are Adam and Eve.
And Eve, yeah.
And so that kind of thing is kind of a weird way of science fiction validating a religious belief. But by and large, I think the tension between faith and evidence is what generates a lot of stories.
Mm-hmm. And one of the interesting things, I think, also, and if I don't know how wide or strong a line in terms of just in general the study of things like religion, people would draw a line between religion and mythology in terms of, well, each religion is said to have its own mythology, and that, of course, is not to boil it down into fact and fable and the like, mostly in terms of just like categorizing the story and each having its own mythos, as it's said. But in terms of things where that takes an apocalyptic approach, it's interesting as well, thinking of, I believe it's the Norse mythology. I'm not exactly up as much with that, but in terms of their tales about the coming deluge that's going to basically leave a couple of people around, things like that, and so that itself is kind of an interesting, I don't know, well, it's supposed to be prophetic in the ways of looking ahead to things like the Ragnarok scenario.
Well, as long as you mention Norse mythology, that it kind of brings in a third kind of storytelling, which isn't really religion, and it isn't really science fiction. That's kind of the superhero movies.
Sure.
Because one of the things that happens in the movie Thor, for example, is you're basically taking Norse mythology and turning it into science fiction. There's a distant planet, and it all is something that it can be explained as in terms of space opera. And that's kind of an interesting strategy as well, where you simply reimagine a religious story as though it were a science fiction story. And this has been done quite a bit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, precisely. And, just this morning, I got to thinking about the ways, things like, if you look back at, well, any of the classical heroes themselves, and then reimagine them in a kind of sci-fi context, things like Gilgamesh, which I believe he's a third divine or something along those lines. In the modern day context, Superman being on Earth, coming from the gods, where he's normal, but being sent here and then becoming, supposedly, well, in Yeah,
there are all kinds of, there have been Superman stories forever, but,
right.
but when Siegel and Schuster decided to write the comic book, supposedly they'd read a science fiction novel by Philip Wiley called Gladiator,
Okay.
which gave them the idea. But they're the ones, I guess, that chose to have him an alien from another planet. So what is just a kind of superhero comic book story, becomes a kind of science fiction story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And with that, of course, things like the religious characterization of, things like Clark Kent being sent into space, being shot into space, as it were,
Right.
as a last hope, of course, mirroring things like, Moses and the river, of course, and those kind of illusions, those kind of things. And, with that, do you think, I suppose one way of putting it would be, does science fiction take on the language of religion, while also, you could say, take on the symbolism, take on the typologies of religion in order to express things? The one that comes to mind for me most often is Frankenstein. In Frankenstein, Frankenstein's monster has the dialogue about, I should have been thy Adam, and yet I'm your fallen angel, sorts of things. Do you think sci-fi takes on the language of religion for a particular purpose?
Sometimes it does, and it depends on the writer. When you mention Mary Shelley, for example, of course, she subtitled Frankenstein the Modern Prometheus, so she was clearly drawing on Greek mythology there. She's drawing a lot on Milton, on Paradise Lost, on fallen angels. There is a terrific series of novels by Aliette de Bodard, a French-Vietnamese writer who lives in Paris but writes in English, in which the fallen gods have basically been at war and they've ruined Paris. And it's a lot of stuff that could have been in Paradise Lost, a lot of Christian imagery, treated pretty much as not really science fiction, but as epic fantasy in that case. And one of the most famous science fiction novels that deals directly with religion is Walter Miller's A Canticle for Leibowitz, which not only takes up a lot of the language and imagery of religion, but it's basically about a group of monks trying to preserve some kind of culture and knowledge after a nuclear war. In other words, it's viewing a post-nuclear apocalypse as something similar to the Dark Ages. And that is another tension that I think shows up a lot in science fiction, where you have the Renaissance, the information being protected secretly by scientists, whereas frequently the religious forces are oppressive forces to hold back science, to hold back new discoveries, to hold on to orthodoxy.
Yeah, and it's interesting you bring that up, because I think that's a good segue into another of the questions, which is, do you think that sci-fi in general, and this of course isn't to particularly say that sci-fi can categorically be said to always have this particular X, Y, Z approach to religion, but do you think that there's a way that sci-fi generally approaches it, and that the majority of science fiction writers would basically come to it, handle it in their stories?
I hate making really broad generalizations about all science fiction writers, since so many of them are writing from different perspectives. For example, one very popular science fiction writer is Orson Scott Card, who's a Mormon who belongs to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And one series of novels basically retells the story of Joseph Smith as a series of fantasy novels. And another series of novels essentially retells the Book of Mormon as a science fiction story. And from his point of view, I'm pretty sure he sees that as a way of promoting the beliefs of the church, making them more accessible to a wider audience, and so forth and so on. On the other hand, there are writers who view religion as almost a pathology. There's a novel by Michael Moorcock called Behold the Man, which is in which basically Christianity is invented almost by accident by a time traveler who goes back trying to find the historical Jesus, and ends up becoming the historical Jesus by accident. So there are attitudes all the way from frankly anti-religious attitudes, religion as oppression, to celebrating religion through science fiction. That gets complicated when you start thinking of religion as something beyond Christianity and its various offshoots. About 20 or 30, you mentioned Norse mythology, for example, which clearly is using a religion as the basis for fantasy. There were a number of writers. Roger Zelazny back in the 70s wrote a novel called Lord of Light, which is based on Hindu mythology. So one of the things that I've seen critiqued about science fiction is that sometimes when you're taking somebody else's religion, or you're taking a religion that really nobody subscribes to anymore, like the Norse myths or the Greek and Roman myths, you're free to use that as science fiction material. In other words, science fiction is any religion you don't believe in.
That's a pretty good category, I think, in terms of that. Like, for instance, I recall the kind of controversy that I'd read about, and I don't know the fine particulars of it, but things like Gene Roddenberry in one of the Star Trek movies that they would make wanted to have this certain starship come that would basically be said to have been, the God of the Old Testament, New Testament, and things like that, and how that got shut down. I think maybe that would have been something that could have gone today, but in terms of that time, something like that was very controversial. And so I think also you could compare that to, say, in the Star Trek series, when they find out that the god Apollo is an alien and just has these superpowers and such, psychokinetic abilities and those sorts of things.
And that's exactly what I mean about appropriating this element. So, I don't think, I think you're also right that when you're making a TV show, especially all the way back in the 60s, or even making a movie, a lot of corporate decision making goes into what you can and can't do. So you'll find a lot more controversial treatment of religion in written science fiction than you will in most movies. I'm trying to think of a good science fiction movie that deals with religion as something other than kind of a joke. The Apollo thing was almost a joke.
Right. Yeah. I also find it interesting. Some of the other stories I've read is that corporate wanted to put a chaplain actually on the starship. I believe that's what I'd read. Which, I mean, so Roddenberry wouldn't really have that because of his particular vision for Star Trek. But personally, I think that would be fascinating, no matter what side you're coming from in terms of religious, secular, because of the fact that, well, we're out here, we're in space. It's like the kind of conversations that you could kind of inspire about that provides an interesting opportunity to have those kind of conversations. I know that, Firefly, for instance, had something similar with having the shepherd, as he was called, on board their ship. But yeah, having those kind of conversations, whether it be in ethics or, epistemology, those sorts of things.
Well, one of the problems with the idea of a chaplain, of course, is that implies, for most people, it implies some particular kind of religion. Do you have Do you have a Christian chaplain? Do you have a Jewish chaplain? Do you have somebody who can speak to Muslims, to Hindus, to Jains, or in which case you basically just have a shipboard philosopher.
Right. Yeah. For some reason now I can't even think of the analog would be, and I can't think of his name, the chaplain from MASH would have a Star Trek version of
something along those lines.
Yeah, that sort of thing going on. I think of also one of the books I'd been reading was a collection of C.S. Lewis's called Of Other Worlds, I believe that's what it was.
Yeah, a collection of his essays.
Yeah. And so one of them was a conversation, I believe Brian Aldiss was part of the conversation, things like that.
Famous conversation between Brian Aldiss, I think, Kingsley Amis, and C.S. Lewis.
Yeah, and I know that one of the things that they mentioned was his series, his trilogy, where he basically had said that he wanted to, his space trilogy, wherein he has the man visiting other planets and such, and talking to other creatures created on other planets. And one of the things they talked about was whether he meant to be didactic with that, basically in terms of teaching the faith and like basically saying if this is what we had said. If this is what the case was, then we would be, this is what it would probably be like, something along those lines. And I know that he had said, well, it wasn't really meant to be didactic per se. But yeah, in other places he'd said that this is me kind of like taking the science fiction genre in a Christian way.
Yeah, taking the imagery of science fiction. There are a lot of debates about that, and clearly Brian Aldiss was not on the side of C.S. Lewis, but C.S. Lewis was using imagery of science fiction, but he had rocket ships, he had people going to Mars, but essentially those were just using terms to write a religious parable. I mean, the idea of, by the time you get to the third volume in that trilogy, the first one was Out of the Silent Planet, and then Paralandra, and then I think That Hideous Strength. It's clear that scientists are the bad guys, that the materialists who believe that the universe can be conquered and shaped through technological means are just flat out evil, and the spiritual people are the heroes. And the tradition that Lewis came out of, he was very influenced by a novel called Voyage to Arcturus, which looks like a science fiction novel because it has a spaceship in it, but none of it makes any scientific sense at all. And there's a lot of this in literary history. There's a famous Chinese novel from the 30s called Cat Country, which people go to Mars and they find out it's ruled by intelligent cats. Well, if you didn't use the name Mars in it, it's just a fantasy land. And you know, outside of that one trilogy of quote unquote science fiction, Lewis is mostly known as a fantasy writer. And his fantasy, like his science fiction, is very much influenced by his religion. I know a couple of writers, for example, who were Jewish kids reading The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe and really getting into this and finding out, wait a minute, this book is trying to turn me into a Christian. This whole thing is about resurrection and sacrifice and so forth and so on. And there's no doubt about the didactic meaning of that.
Right, exactly. And I know that with that, I think he's said similarly, with Narnia, it was about basically showing if Christ had to visit another world, if he had other worlds, right. This might be how he does that, you know, and how he brings about redemption for them as well, which is kind of interesting in terms of like just the same thing he does, well, with what he would be kind of doing in the space trilogy with our cosmos, and that, as you say, fantasy setup, you know, with regards to even like the second book, Paralandra, sees him having to save another world from having, you know, an Eden crisis, if you will. So those sorts of things kind of are what he sees there. Yeah, and so that presents an interesting kind of.
Well, it's probably important that he was a convert to Christianity. He wrote a book about that. Mm-hmm. I think it was called Surprised by Joy was about his wife. And but my guess is that religious converts are much more likely to write that kind of fiction than people who kind of are able to separate their idea of science fiction from their idea of religion.
And now this I again try to keep away from any sort of whether it be kind of implied generalization or loaded question, whatever you want to call it. Do you think that it's pretty, it's there's a way in which you can stably, for somebody who has faith, has a faith, you know, and things like that, kind of positing those and packaging those in sort of a sci-fi story, fiction, or fantasy story, if you want to blur those lines, but possibly keeping to the sci-fi, assuming that's what they're going for here, because I know that fantasy lends itself pretty heavily to allegory at times. Of course, there's exceptions to anything, but talking myself in circles here. Anyway, yeah. So yeah, do you think it's? Do you think there's a good measure of like how they would, in general, keep away from having a heavy hand in terms of...
Yeah, well, you can certainly write about questions of faith while keeping the science fictional part of the narrative science fictional. In other words, you can write about faith as, but you're in a more limited way. If you're writing fantasy, you can pretty much do anything you want. If you're writing science fiction, there are some rules that you have to follow that make it science fiction. And there have been some very serious novels about faith and belief. There's James Blish's A Case of Conscience back in the 1950s. There was a novel by Mary Doria Russell called The Sparrow, which deal with usually, interestingly enough, usually Jesuits. Science fiction writers like to write about Jesuits because Jesuits historically have been kind of the science and exploring branch of Catholicism. So you have a setup already where a character is both committed to rationality and to faith. And that combination is being tested in those novels. Can an alien species, not part of our own special creation, have a soul, for example? You can ask questions like that. You can ask them in ways that respect the faith of your characters, but at the same time follow the rigorous demands of what science fiction is. In other words, are aliens part of the same creation we are? This is a question that one of the characters in a Case of Conscience has to talk about. There are characters in, I mentioned the Canticle for Leibowitz, that deal with the same kinds of questions. So you can write about people who believe and are sincere about their faith and are trying to behave according to the ethics of that faith within a science fiction context. And that shows up quite a bit in the literature. You're right, when I think about it, it doesn't show up that much in movies or TV.
And it's, with that, as you say, space, the space is a Jesuits thing, if that's the way that's the way I put it. Jesuits in space. I don't remember if that is the case in, I know that one of those stories that comes up frequently with this is The Star by Arthur C. Clarke, I believe.
Right.
I think that individual.
I think the guy is a Jesuit in that too.
Yeah. But yeah, the kind of situation being that the Star of Bethlehem was a supernova that snuffed out this alien civilization, right. And so that becomes a kind of personal crisis for the individual that's observing this, and so that brings out, well, it's kind of a theodicy in itself. The problem.
It is.
Yeah.
The basic question the character is left with is, would God, simply in order to send a message to us on Earth, be willing to wipe out an entire advanced civilization? And of course, the story doesn't answer the question. But it's, so the stories that deal most effectively with religion, I think, are ones that don't try to turn religion into science fiction or science fiction into religion, but that deal with characters who are facing those dilemmas.
Among the things that I think about a lot of the time when I'm looking at science fiction and religion, and one of those that comes up with how I look at how it's being handled, and maybe it's because I think my real initiation with sci-fi came through Star Trek, as I mentioned a few times already. But with regards to things like Roddenberry's view of the future, which I mentioned before, and I kind of, I don't know, poke fun a little bit, kind of considering them a little bit of Lennon-topias, if you will, John Lennon, that is, with a view of the future. Imagine no religion, imagine, these sorts of things. Communitarian, if that's a good term to use. View of the future, kind of like what the Federation is in the future for Roddenberry, and so he imagined it very secular. Do you think that is a pretty frequent theme in terms of people's view of how progress will affect humanity, about prioritizing other things above religion?
Well, I think that to some extent, Roddenberry was a creature of his time. He grew up in the 60s, which there was a kind of utopian liberalism. We can create a future in which is very tolerant, and as long as we go around blowing up people who don't believe in tolerance. But by and large, I think that's a kind of view of a kind of liberal world order, which historically science fiction writers have seen as happening. I mean, there's this one writer called it a consensus cosmogony that science fiction built up over a century, really, where, you know, first of all, we colonize the moon, and then we colonize the planets, and then we expand into space, and eventually we have a galactic empire, and it's all just basically, when you think about it, a recapitulation of the last 2,000 years, except going into outer space instead of going to new continents on Earth. And religion is never explicitly discussed in that, I don't think, except in the idea that maybe there is some endpoint, some goal. One of the religious thinkers who seems to have had an influence on a number of science fiction writers was another Jesuit, a philosopher named Teilhard de Chardin, who wrote about the omega point, the idea that the universe is aiming towards something. There's some kind of not just a New Testament apocalypse, but some point at which all things converge. And that became a very attractive idea because you can keep that in the distant future. You can have millions of years of history to write about pointing toward that, but you don't ever have to actually portray it or deal with it as a matter of belief.
You know, I think of also kind of the perspective of that kind of, you know, with the utopianism of the last century heading forward, the ways in which, as a whole, it kind of reflects a certain view of some of those late Enlightenment thinkers with their view of, you know, things turn from early in religious orthodox to kind of the theological / philosophical, until at last the scientific arises, and those sorts of transformations arise in some sort of stage. And so I kind of picture that as a way in which that he had particularly envisioned the future kind of progressing. And so I know that it seems at least in terms of the science fiction we get on TV, at least, and I know that generally grittier it tends to be better in terms of TV today, and that's kind of been a complaint about the newer Star Treks and those sorts of things. But not to get into that controversy, but the situation being is that we kind of see a lot more of, you know, characters and emphasizing those sorts of flaws in characters, and kind of like basically, I think of it more if people are less utopian, and maybe you can speak to whether this observation is correct, but less utopian in general in all science fiction outside of Star Trek as well. That is on TV and the movies and the like, but more like, if, you know, more of a hypothetical, if I were in a starship today, and if, you know, me and my neighbors and people I know, like those sorts of things, that kind of more, I guess, gritty realism, I think, is what people may go for more today. I don't know if that.
I think there are 3 or 4 things going on here. One is the classic utopianism, which obviously Roddenberry didn't invent. You go back and look at H.G. Wells's one movie, Things to Come, from 1936. And it's the same sort of thing. He has, well, what he calls airmen, basically pilots, take over the world. It's kind of weird, but in 1936, that's, but this happens after a decades-long war and a period of depression and poverty and so forth. And eventually science takes over and rules. And that's kind of the faith that the late Wells had. And the opposite of that, I suppose, is what we've seen way too much of in movies and TV, and that is just all-purpose dystopias. Everybody's miserable from now on, which is gritty, but somewhere in between those two are the kinds of things I think you're talking about, the kinds of working class space crews, the things you get in The Expanse, the things you even get in the Alien movies. Alien movies are movies about you know, basically lower class workers on what amounts to a mining ship. It kind of, in terms of movies, it kind of set a new standard for what spaceships look like. You know, they're not gleaming, they're rusty and they're dripping with water, and they're, in this particular case, full of monsters. But if you leave the alien out of the Alien movie, you've got a pretty grim view of the future as a worker's dystopia.
Yeah, and that presents kind of an interesting picture of where humanity is, and I know that I forget what it is in terms of G.K. Chesterton's thing about basically kind of the main empirical claim of Christianity is that people are suffer from it, and it ain't depravity, and it seems as though that kind of shares lends itself more to what we're seeing in terms of character conflicts and those sorts of things. And less of the utopian kind of crystal spires. I will say I started watching Things to Come. I didn't get too far. I guess I did not.
You have to get past. Yeah, you have to get past the war that goes on for a long time in that movie.
Yeah, I was like, this is going somewhere, but I'm not sure where it is yet. And so it was those classical utopian thoughts and where things are headed present an interesting light for kind of the times as well, as you had said. And so also one of the classic stories I think that kind of wanted to touch upon as well were kind of the stories about human apotheosis and about those sorts of things. One instance, and the one I kind of like zero in on a lot of the time, is like Forbidden Planet, those sorts of things, as well. And you can see today the development of other stories and things. I think that Transcendence was one of those movies that kind of showed uploading human consciousness, trying to become God, and those sorts of stories, historically, especially with the kind of the moral at the end of Forbidden Planet was, don't try to become God, those sorts of things. And so there's kind of a Babel kind of Icarus kind of takeaway. Do you think that is still a message that generally science fiction kind of evokes? Generally, I haven't. Maybe you're obviously the expert here, and so I'm sure if there's somebody that knows about it, it would be you. But in terms of where we are, as far as that kind of moral lesson, it doesn't seem as though that many shows end with like people actually attaining godhood and that sort of thing. That's still an applicable lesson?
I think I think science fiction kind of worked its way through that. There were all kinds of stories of not just people obtaining God, but or becoming God, but artificial intelligence is becoming God. I mean, there were enough stories like this all the way back in the 40s and 50s that a famous short story by Frederick Brown, which you may have heard because it was started out as a short story and became a joke that people just passed around, which has to do with all the computers in the universe in the far future being linked together into one massive computer. And they finally asked that computer the question they've been wanting to ask for forever. You can also, before I give you the punchline, you can see where Douglas Adams stole this from too. So they finally link all the computers in the universe together and ask the ultimate computer the ultimate question: is there a God? And the computer says there is now. And that's essentially as far as you can go with that. I think the idea of people attaining godhood, or artificial intelligence attaining godhood, is kind of an interesting idea, but it's not a very good story idea, because where do you go with that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And yeah, that sort of story, usually it may be a moral lesson or things along those lines, and kind of that playing out of those sorts of things. Also, let's see, what was I going to say? Okay, do you and with that, you see a lot of, in terms of technology shaping religion as well. And I mean, in terms of like some of it has a real grounding today. I know that they're with groups like transhumanists and those sorts of folks, individuals, and organizations, kind of take their bearings of like working towards those sorts of things.
Well, you can take ideas like the rapture, for example, and there's a very popular idea in science fiction in the last 2 or 3 decades called the singularity, the idea that at some point artificial intelligence is going to either outstrip us to the point where we don't understand it or incorporate us. And there have been a number of stories, recently a series of stories by Ken Liu, who's an excellent writer, L-I-U, in which people just choose to upload themselves. And the world becomes depopulated as people choose to go into virtual space where they can basically live in any environment they want. They can live forever. They can replicate everything they could have lived in the real world. And of course, the people left behind are pretty much in the same situation as the people left behind in the rapture would be. So that's taking kind of a religious idea and translating it into science fiction terms, but translating it into science fiction terms that are at least somewhat credible. I mean, the idea of uploading consciousness has been just it's almost a cliche in science fiction these days.
Yeah, you know, in terms of those sorts of things, and I know that whenever those you know, things get that kind of a press and those sorts of things in real life, and those movements towards it, that's kind of the thing of like inventing the afterlife. You know, those kind of philosophical questions arise with you know, where we're headed in terms of those situations. Yeah. And with that kind of also on the other end kind of brings up an interesting question of how fiction authors will create religious, create religions in themselves in order for, you know, world building purposes, those sorts of things. And brings up another interesting thing. I've been, one of my recent listens has been Hyperion. And so kind of the conversation in there is actually also what we talked about earlier in terms of secularization in the future, those sorts of things. And among those is kind of this priest kind of coming to terms with his belief that things are kind of falling apart in his church. And so he kind of comes to terms with where he is and where he's headed, and that it plays with religion in interesting ways. Right. And among those is they also create an interesting fusion, which I'd like to actually read more about in terms of how it kind of codifies things. As one of their mentions is of Zengnosticism, which is obviously a creation of the author, but those sorts of comparisons, earthly, you know, I can imagine somewhere where you could meet kind of those syncretic elements of, say, Buddhism and Gnosticism, you know, in late antiquity, but, you know, in terms of how that plays out.
But Gnosticism has always been attractive to science fiction and fantasy, simply because it's secret knowledge. You know, it's kind of you have to be an initiate in order to understand this, and so there's a kind of subset of science fiction that deals with alchemy, for example, and there's some very interesting historical novels. There's it's a very ambitious set of novels, but it's actually a very good set of historical novels that are also science fiction novels by Neil Stephenson called The System of the World. And one of them is largely about Newton and the Royal Society. And one of the things that becomes very clear is that, yeah, Newton believed in alchemy. He was not rejecting it. He was trying to figure out how to fit it in with his experimental science. So the idea that there are parallel patterns of thought in religious belief, especially in kind of, you're right, the Gnostic, the cryptic, secret society religious beliefs, and the idea that scientists are an elite group of people who know things that we don't, is a kind of parallel appeal, I think, to readers.
All right. Yeah, and I think that with that, the time is kind of coming towards a close, I believe, and so I know that I got to let you go at some point. So as much as I dread it, but no, you know, the conversation's been good. But one of the I kind of wanted to ask a general question in that, with all that's going on in science fiction, and we talked about it in kind of a smaller, you know, in the particular lens of how it treats religion and those sorts of things. What was it to you that drew you towards, you know, working in such great detail and studying science fiction as it is? What kind of drew you towards that?
That's a fascinating question. I think when I was a kid, I started reading Ray Bradbury was what got me into science fiction, probably, and then later I discovered Asimov and Heinlein and other writers. I suspect part of it. I was growing up in a small town in Missouri, as a matter of fact, and these I mean, it was very limited in what I can see and do. There was one movie theater, that sort of thing. So the idea of being able to travel to other planets, the idea of gigantic cities in the future, all the things I wanted to see in my life. And that, you know, when you're a kid, you think, okay, by the time I'm 60 or 70, I will see some of these things. And science fiction kind of constantly held out that promise, but also it was a fiction that dealt very provocatively with ideas. And I think at a certain age, if you hit it at the right age, where you're thinking about things like the meaning of the universe and what's my place in it and that sort of thing, science fiction dealt with that, still deals with it, in a much more direct way than a lot of other fiction does. And so it just seems to open up endless possibilities. And then as you learn more about science fiction, you learn that, well, the best science fiction can also do what good mainstream fiction does, which it can tell you about characters and it can deal with moral dilemmas. And during my lifetime, science fiction has gotten a lot more mature and frankly, a lot better than it was when I started reading it.
Awesome. Hey, that's a great great sign. Great, you know, trend, I suppose. You know, so with that, do you have a particular, you know, book or movie, maybe piece of media or something along those lines that you would particularly recommend? You know, maybe however many you really want to go for this, because I always hate, you know, people like ask when, you know, what's your favorite book or movie or TV show or anything like that. That's such a terrible question. But do you have anything that you'd recommend in terms of, you know, reading, seeing more about the topic of religion and science fiction?
This is one I recommend all the time because I think it touches upon most of the questions we've been discussing. And it's a movie that some people these days find it hard to watch, and that's 2001, Space Odyssey, because it has ideas in it that I don't agree with at all. It has the idea of alien intervention, ancient astronauts somehow directing human evolution, which even Arthur Clarke thought at the time was silly, but it does raise the question of what's the purpose of evolution? And it does so in a kind of beautiful, leisurely way. It's not an action movie by any stretch of the imagination, but it's one idea after another, and then terrific imagery in between. And to watch that movie today, because I was giving a lecture on it just last, its 50th anniversary was just a couple of years ago. And so I looked at it again, and you realize, okay, there's no CGI in that movie at all. It's just brilliantly made. It looks gorgeous even today. So that's one example. There are other examples of movies and books, but that's one that brings together a lot of different aspects of science fiction. Arthur Clarke was somebody who, as you mentioned, the star, likes to deal with ideas of religion and eschatology and that sort of thing, even though he almost always writes himself into a corner because he doesn't really believe in these transcendental endings, but he writes his way into them anyway. There was actually a TV adaptation of the Childhood's End a few years ago that touched upon some of that, and it dealt a lot with how religious belief and science interact. You mentioned Dan Simmons, recent writers. Who would I recommend to talk about religious ideas in science fiction? One writer whose stories I think touch upon a lot of this is Ted Chiang, who's never written a novel, but he's certainly one of the most important science fiction writers alive, and he's written stories that are set within religious beliefs. In other words, his very first story was called Tower of Babylon, and it's a story set within Babylonian mythology. People are climbing a tower, and they climb past the clouds, and then they climb past the moon and so forth, because this is the way the Babylonians viewed the universe. And Ted's argument, which I agree with, is that it's a science fiction story. It's just that it's a science fiction story written within the framework of another belief system. If you're a Babylonian 4,000 years ago, this story is a perfectly fine science fiction story. And he's even written a science fiction story from the point of view of a kind of fundamentalist Christian, where the pavement opens up and you can see hell down below you. So in other words, I would argue that what the most interesting writers today are doing are using science fiction as a way of constructing a story, but not necessarily limiting the worldview to the current scientific worldview. In other words, if you're following the rules, even if the rules are given to you by a religion, you can write a science fiction story within that framework.
Now that's really fascinating, and I hadn't heard of those examples, and I'll be sure to check those out. But you know, I've been thinking recently about things with Johann Kepler's Somnium and those kind of like early proto science fiction situations where he's got the whole setting kind of like an observation of the moon, those sorts of things, and he's got some kind of occult elements in there, which are interesting. Or even with Verne, whether with the kind of what we know now, how much we can like retroactively look back and call these things science fiction, shooting a cannon at the moon type thing.
Yeah.
Wouldn't be science fiction in today's context, but that's an interesting contextual way of looking at that.
Well, I mean, when you go back and look at proto science fiction, you could look at Campanella and Godwin, and you mentioned Kepler. Those are science fiction works within the framework of what they thought to be science.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
For that matter, so was Frankenstein. I mean,
right.
People argue that Frankenstein is really a Gothic novel and not a science fiction novel. But when you read it, the degree to which Victor Frankenstein rejects alchemy and rejects magic and insists that all he does is based on experimental science. And when you realize that Mary Shelley knew a good deal about experimental science, she knew about Galvani's experiments, for example, that it's a work of science fiction based pretty firmly in the science of its time.
Which is really interesting also, and I think that that it can get away with some more just considering Frankenstein's secret knowledge, I guess, if you will, of his main secret of how he creates life and when it comes to his grave and that sort of thing. But yeah, his general approach is pretty much firmly still tucked in science fiction. But yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it.
Hey, well, thank you for inviting me. I hope you have good luck with this.
All right. Well, thanks so much. And thanks for everyone for listening. Have a great day.